This is the 15th in a series of programs I'm doing on wisdom and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. Past programs have dealt with the following questions. What is wisdom? What might be some of the characteristics of wise people? What might be a wise person's attitude towards fears and desires? And how might a wise person deal with his or her fears and desires? What might be a wise person's attitude towards life and death? And also, several of the programs dealt with the question, what might be a wise person's attitude towards joy? In other words, where might a wise person look for joy? Where might a wise person look to make his or her life more tranquil and joyful? This program will deal with the question, how does one acquire wisdom? And at the outset, I think it's important to review the working definition of wisdom I'm using. Wisdom is good sense, good judgment. If you ask a philosopher what wisdom is, he or she will probably tell you it's a knowledge of reality, a knowledge of the way things really are. Darryl Strawberry, former Major League Baseball player who got into some trouble because of his abuse of alcohol and other drugs, I think said something that helps us to understand what constitutes wisdom. Again, baseball player Darryl Strawberry said this: I know everything about hitting a baseball and nothing about living. Aristotle also provides some illumination here. Aristotle said that wisdom is knowledge of the highest things. And Socrates, I think, gives an example of what Aristotle was talking about. Socrates claimed the most important question any of us can ask ourselves is this: how shall I live? And among the questions Socrates believed we should ask ourselves to try to answer that particular question are the following. How much should I value money, social status, self-discipline, sex, honesty, being popular, religion, solitude, love? Unfortunately, we can't get wisdom from a computer. Computers can help us to learn many important things, but unfortunately, computers cannot help us to deal with the most important aspects of daily living. If you think your children can gain wisdom from a computer, think again. Again, the question for today: how might one go about acquiring wisdom? Well, so many of the famous thinkers have said that wisdom begins with humility. The idea is that many people assume they already have wisdom and therefore don't seek wisdom. Shakespeare put it well. One of Shakespeare's characters says this: the fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. Besides humility, acquiring wisdom begins with an introspective attitude. It's an attitude that involves self-criticism. All of the great philosophers, all of the great religionists have said that if we wish to acquire wisdom, it's indispensable that we engage in self-criticism. Socrates also claimed that we need to be inquisitive, that we're not going to acquire wisdom if we aren't inquisitive. Socrates put it this way, and I'm quoting him: life without inquiry is not worth living. Life without inquiry is not worth living. Confucius put the emphasis on learning. He said this: to be fond of learning is close to wisdom. What's the main subject one should investigate, again, if one is trying to acquire wisdom? Well, the main subject, according to the great philosophers, is reality, the way things really are, not the way we imagine things really are. When we talk about acquiring a knowledge of reality, we're talking about acquiring a knowledge of what is true and false about so many of the important aspects of daily living. What's true, what's false about life? What's true, what's false about oneself, about other people, about the path to a fulfilling life? So many of the great thinkers have said that very often we have illusions, serious mistaken ideas about what the good life might consist of. Plato said that many of us think we understand reality when we really don't. And Plato, to illuminate his idea about the idea that we have so many illusions, uses in one of his writings his famous parable of the cave. Parable of the cave. And let me take a couple of minutes to tell you about it, because it's quite interesting, I think, and enlightening. Plato sets up a fictional situation whereby people have been confined to a cave since childhood, and their legs and necks are fettered. They can't move their necks. They can only look straight ahead. And behind them in this cave is a fire. And also behind them in this cave is a wall, a rather short wall. And on the wall, every now and then, certain people place statues of men and of other living things. But all the people who are confined in the cave can see, again, the people whose legs and necks are fettered, all they can see are shadows on the wall in front of them. Well, Plato stimulates our thinking by telling us that they would assume, probably, since they've been confined this way since childhood, that the shadows are reality. But if these people who are confined to this cave could be released and could go outside into the sunlight, their idea of what might be reality would be very different. They would no longer see shadows, but again would see things more clearly in the sunlight. And again, Plato uses this so-called parable of the cave to illustrate the idea that so often we think we understand reality when in fact we don't, when in fact we have many mistaken ideas about what is true and what is false in life. A good example of this, perhaps, would be marriage. I think it's fair to say that many people, before they marry, think they really do understand the nature of marriage. But perhaps a month, 2 months, a year, maybe even a day after being married, people's ideas of what constitutes marriage might change dramatically, so that they see more of the reality of marriage than they saw before they married. Why bother to learn about the way things really are? Well, so many of the great thinkers have said that we suffer from our ignorance, that ignorance is not bliss. Jesus indeed said this: "The truth will make you free." And Santayana, a very famous American philosopher, in talking about one of the paths to wisdom, said this: "Wisdom comes by disillusionment. Wisdom comes by disillusionment." The idea is that as we grow older, if we are growing gracefully and if we are acquiring wisdom, one of the ways in which we will obtain wisdom is by being freed from some false ideas we had. Schopenhauer, echoing Santayana in a certain sense, or maybe I should say Santayana was echoing Schopenhauer, since Schopenhauer lived before Santayana. In any event, Schopenhauer said we all have certain blind spots about life. We all have certain blind spots about ourselves and about other people. The Buddhists claim that our aim in life, our goal in life, should be to attain nirvana. Nirvana is the Buddhist heaven. And of what does it consist? Well, nirvana does not take place after death. One can achieve nirvana in life. Nirvana, according to the Buddhists, is a psychological state. Nirvana is a psychological state in which one is free from all false ideas. In other words, it's a state in which one has a very clear idea about what constitutes reality. In other words, about what's true and what is false. We've been talking about how one acquires wisdom. And so far, I've suggested to you that if one desires to acquire wisdom, it's going to require humility, an introspective attitude involving self-criticism, and it's also going to involve studying and learning. Besides those things, acquiring wisdom will also very much involve evaluating one's experiences. It's been said that the wise person is a person who has digested very well his or her experiences, so that a wise person has learned from his or her experiences. An example, we all wish to be happier, and some of us at times, probably all of us at times, have looked in the wrong place for happiness. And if we evaluate our attempts at trying to become happier, I think we will find that some of our efforts were right on track, some of our experiences were right on track, but other efforts were misguided. And if we can learn from these misguided experiences to secure more happiness in life, well, that's one of the ways in which we secure wisdom. The idea is that some elderly people have wisdom, other elderly people don't have wisdom. And what often is the difference between these groups of people? Well, generally speaking, the group of elderly people who have wisdom are people who have learned from their past experiences, people who have evaluated them, digested them, and learned from them, so that generally speaking, they usually avoid making the same mistakes that they made perhaps in their younger days. Whereas elderly people who have not become wise are perhaps still making the same mistakes in their old age as they made 20, 30, 40 years ago. Something else that can help us on the path to wisdom, indeed, so many of the great thinkers have said a certain experience, the experience of suffering, is indispensable to acquiring wisdom. I know some people might find that strange, that suffering can help us to become wiser. Pascal, very famous French philosopher and devout Christian, said this, and I'm quoting him: 1 hour's pain is a better teacher than all the philosophers put together. How so? Well, suffering, whether it be mental or physical, can help us to achieve perspective, can help us to focus on what's really important in life. In other words, suffering can help remind us of what's really important in life. I recall years ago on PBS seeing a very interesting program about a man dying from cancer. He had only months to live, and in the course of the program, they showed him going to the hospital pretty frequently for chemotherapy, and they showed him at home interacting with his family. And in one of the interviews, I remember so well, he talked about the idea that since he only had a few months to live, it was really focusing his mind on what was really important in life and forcing him, in a certain sense, to use his time more wisely than he'd ever used it. And he was talking about the benefits that this experience of having cancer had provided. And he lamented the fact that he was going to die, since now he felt he was wiser than he had ever been in his life. But then he went on to say something quite interesting. He said that if some miracle cure could come about so that he wouldn't die within the next few months, he feared, he said, that he would lose this perspective and perhaps go back to his old foolish ways. And that was the expression he used, go back to his old foolish ways. So the idea was, again, that suffering had focused his mind on what was really important in life, and in a certain sense had assisted him in thinking more clearly about life, himself, his family, and other aspects of daily living. Dostoevsky, the famous Russian novelist, put it this way: suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. And the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, tells us that his motivation in seeking wisdom was suffering. That the Buddha, in his early 20s, realized how much suffering there is in this world. And beginning in his early and late 20s, he sought wisdom and left the life of being a prince and began the life of a traveler, a wanderer in search of enlightenment. Eventually he did find enlightenment, found what he considered to be wisdom, and died at the age of 80 in a nirvanic state. You recall, as I mentioned before, to the Buddhists, nirvana is a state in which one is free of false ideas. But again, the point I wish to emphasize, that it was Buddha's suffering, it was his suffering that motivated him to undertake this quest for wisdom. Suffering has led people to seek answers, solutions, or at least coping mechanisms, in the great books, in religion, philosophy, psychology, and religion. Suffering has led people to change the way in which they live. Thomas Merton, the most famous of American monks, in his autobiography entitled The Seven-Story Mountain, tells us that before he became a monk, a Christian monk, he was a graduate student at Columbia University. And in his autobiography, he tells us that he was spiritually dead at this time. Those are his words, spiritually dead. He tells us that he was smoking several packs of cigarettes a day, and that he frequented bars in the evening and often drank too much. And this monk also tells us that before becoming a monk, in his days as a graduate student at Columbia, he fathered an illegitimate child. He then tells us in his autobiography that when he sunk to the lowest level in his life, that he then decided he had to do something. And it was by coincidence that he contacted certain people who suggested that he visit a monastery, a Catholic monastery at Gethsemane in Kentucky. And he did, and eventually converted to Catholicism. He had been a Protestant, converted to Catholicism, and became a person who arguably is the most famous monk in American history. Again, Thomas Merton. I highly recommend his book, The Seven-Story Mountain. I think it's a book that believers as well as unbelievers could enjoy and learn from, and perhaps acquire some wisdom from reading it. Suffering has also led people to change the way they think about life and people. Indeed, it has been said that wisdom is a consciousness. Wisdom is an awareness. Wisdom is a particular way of looking at life and people. Many thinkers have said that life is made significant by the struggle. Again, life is made significant by the struggle, by how we deal with our problems, by how we deal with our pain, both mental and physical. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who spent several years as an inmate in a Nazi concentration camp and wrote a wonderful book entitled Man's Search for Meaning, has put it this way. Viktor Frankl has said, the way we deal with our problems can give our lives a certain dignity. The way we deal with our problems can give our lives a certain dignity. He goes on to say that if despite our problems, we can treat other people in a loving way, in a just way, and even reach out to them to help them with their problems, that can give our lives a beautiful quality and meaning. Mother Teresa has commented that if we worry too much about ourselves, we won't have time to worry about other people. Christianity and several other religions have emphasized the connection between suffering and wisdom. Christianity, and again, several other religions, have taught that suffering, properly used, can promote holiness and spirituality in our lives. It is interesting that the cross, an instrument of torture, is the symbol of Christianity. St. Augustine, one of the most famous of Christian thinkers, said that this life is a trial, and since this life is a trial, it will inevitably involve much unhappiness, much suffering. And the question is, how will we deal with that suffering? So far, in talking about what might be the path to wisdom and what the great thinkers have said about it, I've pointed out that they talk about humility and introspection being indispensable towards acquiring wisdom. They talk about the importance of studying and learning. They talk about the importance of evaluating one's experiences. And they talk about the role that suffering can play in helping us to achieve wisdom. Contemporary writer Deepak Chopra has outlined what he believes are the 7 laws of spiritual success. The 7 laws of spiritual success. Really, what they are aids in helping us to achieve wisdom. And among his 7 laws are the following. He says, we need solitude and silence on a daily basis. That solitude and silence will very much help us in our quest for wisdom. And he says that when we experience solitude and silence, it's very important that we engage in deep listening to our inner selves. And he says that we will find answers, or at least partial solutions, to many of our problems. Again, if we engage in deep listening to our inner selves. Deepak Chopra also says if we are going to obtain wisdom, it's very important that we escape from our conditioning, to escape the prison of our conditioning. All people, in one way or another, are subjected to some conditioning, some very harmful conditioning in life. It might come from one's parents, it might come from one's teachers, from advertising, television, music, etc. But the idea is, if we're going to wake up and acquire wisdom, it's very important that we escape from the prison of our conditioning. Let me give a short example concerning men and the concept of manliness. I wonder how many men have been conditioned to believe that to be a real man, one must be involved in some way in sports, either as a participant or a spectator or both. That there's something manly about sports. Well, I think most of the great thinkers would laugh at this idea, be very amused at the idea that there's any connection between manliness and athleticism. The great thinkers, at least the vast majority of them, would say that a man should judge his degree of manliness by the degree of his integrity, that his ability at sports is irrelevant in judging the degree of his manliness, but that the degree of his integrity is very relevant if he wishes to judge his degree of manliness. What do you think about that? Paul Tillich, very famous theologian, talked about the importance of doubting, of skepticism, if one wishes to become a wise person. Paul Tillich claimed that dogmatism can be, and indeed is, an enemy in our quest for wisdom. Tillich said this, and I'm quoting him, "Doubt is the necessary tool of knowledge. Doubt is the necessary tool of knowledge." Voltaire, the famous French intellectual, put it this way: doubt is not a very agreeable state, but certainty is a ridiculous one. Certainty is a ridiculous one. The idea that there are very few things in life about which we can be certain. Former Harvard psychology professor Gordon Allport distinguished between mature religious believers and immature religious believers. In his book entitled The Individual and His Religion, Professor Allport said this: mature religious believers are people who have deep religious beliefs, but they also have doubts. And also, they're willing to consider evidence that runs counter to their beliefs. Whereas Professor Allport claimed that immature religious believers are people who have no doubts about their beliefs. They're absolutely certain, and they will not consider any evidence that runs counter to their beliefs. The Dalai Lama provides some illumination here. The Dalai Lama is considered by some to be the Pope of Buddhism, although he objects to that title, by the way. But he was once asked, what if science proves certain Buddhist beliefs to be wrong? What will the Buddhists do? And the Dalai Lama, showing a certain beautiful humility, I think, said this. The Dalai Lama said, well, if science should prove certain Buddhist beliefs wrong, I guess what we'll have to do is to change some of our beliefs. I see I'm running short on time, so I will continue with my answer, or at least with the answer so many of the great thinkers have provided, to the question, how does one go about acquiring wisdom, in my next program. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. Thoreau, in his masterpiece, Walden, penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.